It's the Dan Hannan principle, which is usually audible when people assume they know what you're talking about. There's too many and they don't understand what you're talking about.
Jacob often falls on that one.
Right, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming to this next event in our Onward, Future of Conservatism event series. Thank you very much for joining us at the Unheard Club this evening. Thank you very much to Unheard for facilitating us. And welcome to all of you and to those of you who are joining us online. We've got a fantastic panel this evening. My name is Gavin Rice, by the way, Director of the Future of Conservatism project at Onward. Just on housekeeping, we are expecting to be joined by Minister Lee Rowley, but he is in the House of Commons right now, driving reform, taking the leasehold bill through, and there is voting. We are hoping that he's going to be able to join us after that voting is complete. I will go through our panel here. On my left, we have Katie Bourne, who is the Police and Crime Commissioner for Sussex and is serving in her third term. She was first elected in 2012, re-elected in 2016 and 2021, is the lead of the APCC portfolio group on business crime and road safety, had a very successful career in business prior to entering politics, has done fantastic work on anti-social behaviour and on domestic abuse and many other areas as well. And we're very glad that she's able to join us here this evening. On my right, I have Nicholas Boys-Smith, who is Chair of the Office for Place, is the founding director and now Chair of the social enterprise Create Streets, and is an influential writer on design, planning and the history of towns and cities. Absolutely fascinating mind on the whole subject of place and the built environment, and very glad that you're able to join us this evening. We have a substitution today. John Yates, unfortunately, is in hospital or is not well, so we wish him the very best. He is alive. He's been texting us, so we hope it's nothing too serious.
Last time he texted you?
The last time he texted us, he was alive. So obviously we wish him well. As a last-minute stand-in, we are joined by our own Deputy Director at Onward, Adam Hawksby, on the far right on the end there. But Adam does bring a particular hat to this, which is that he is the chair of the government's Towns Unit. And in addition to the work that he's done on this topic, especially levelling up through Onward, he has been going up and down the country over the last few weeks, visiting many towns up and down the country, getting experience of communities on the front line. And so hopefully we'll have some really interesting concrete examples and nuggets of what he's been seeing throughout this country. So we will get started then. We'll hear from each speaker. We'll have a little bit of discussion, and then we'll go to some audience Q&A afterwards. The theme of place is absolutely central to conservatism. Was it Lord Willits we were discussing earlier? Said that conservatism is about roots and about wings. And historically, conservatives have placed value on both. There's a degree to which recently we have talked more about wings, about aspiration, about meritocracy, about achievement, and all these excellent things that are very important. But perhaps we've spoken less about roots, about connectedness, about belonging, about relationships, and those things that we know as conservatives really make life worth living. Onward has a very fine pedigree on this topic. One of its seminal reports, The Politics of Belonging, which some of you may be familiar with, I think really sought to recapture and put back on the agenda this idea of a conservatism that pays more attention to themes of community, of place, of security, both in a social and in an economic sense, but also sought to shine a light on those communities within our country that perhaps feel as though, and in some cases have, been left behind. So this evening we're going to talk about this subject of place from a variety of angles, and we've got some excellent expertise here today. Nicholas, I'm going to start with you, if I may. So you've done fantastic work at Create Streets, looking at the way in which we can rejuvenate place and embolden placemaking in this country, with a particular focus on the built environment, on aesthetics and how that interacts with community. Can you talk to us about how you think we can have a revolution and a renovation in place in this country?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, other than the people in the front row who mysteriously disappeared.
Very naughty.
You need stand-ins there as well.
The first time I gave a talk at Great Street, someone said I needed more numbers. So the numbers I'm going to have one keyword, which is in fact place, 2 paradoxes, 3 problems, 4 arguments, and 5 proposals. I've actually quite rarely for me, I've prepared what I'm going to say. So whether that's bad news or good news, I'll let you judge after the next half hour. But no, sorry, that's I'd like to start, if I may, if you'll forgive me, with one of my favourite quotations, which is from a Whig historian, perhaps the last of the great Whig historians, not a Tory, Jim Trevelyan, who wrote in his introduction to the Social History of England that the poetry of history he wrote, lies in the quasi-miraculous fact that once on this earth, once on this familiar spot of ground, walked other men and women as actual as we are today, thinking their own thoughts, swayed by their own passions, but now all gone, one generation, vanishing after another, gone as utterly as we shall shortly all be gone, as ghosts at cockcrow. There are interwoven themes, ladies and gentlemen, I think, in that quotation, of place, yes, but of civility, of the sacred, of communion with the past and with the future, which I think go to quite a heart of essentially what we're talking about this evening, which I'd just perhaps like to unpack for you. The first of my paradoxes is that we have a very place-based political system. All MPs, sit for a constituency. They're physically based, and yet over the last, I'm not sure if it's generation or a bit more than generation, to talk about place as something that matters to our lives, to the nature of our interactions with our fellow men and women, has become completely devalued until, I'd argue, the last few years, where hopefully we are leading a bit of renaissance in that. When I first proposed to set up Great Street, so I spoke to a friend of mine who's now a very senior member of the government, and he basically said no one will ever care about that. They'll all laugh. But I mean, to some degree, I said, well, they're not laughing now. To some degree, we are talking about place, which I'm pleased about. So those of you who know me won't be surprised to hear I make the case for place as one of the roads back to the Little Platoons and to interacting well with our fellow men and women, to civility and to communion. I think there are 4 key reasons for that. The first, if you like, is the simple or utilitarian argument. Now, you might argue perhaps that everything else will flow from that. So there are very, very predictable interactions between the types of places in which we spend our days and nights and how we interact as humans and how happy we feel. I could go on for this for hours and have it out as present, so I won't do that now, I promise. But I'll just pick out a few. Front gardens. There's a range of studies in Denmark, in Holland, in Australia, that finds that if you live on streets with modest front gardens, about the distance between us here, perhaps a little bit longer, you actually tend to talk to your neighbours more. If it's a too big a front garden, you're hidden behind the bushes or behind the parked car. If there's no front garden at all, there's no reason to be there. But a modest front garden in which you might be picking the roses or mowing the lawn or whatever you're doing, actually it's a good way to speak to your neighbours as they go past you, without them being on your space or you upon theirs. So there's one example. Second example, dark bushes in very large spaces. And in the post-war period, we're very good at creating large spaces. Most people are nervous, if that's the route to our front door and it's not a well-trodden path, that someone might jump out of us at it, even if there's not a huge risk of that. Thirdly, traffic. There's a series of studies. The most recent one is in Bristol. Similar streets with different levels of traffic, from very low to very high. The very high level traffic, if I had a chart, I could show you the map. When you map the friendship patterns on that street, knowing your neighbours is a good thing, I think we're sort of taking it perhaps as read, as long as you don't have to talk to them when you don't want to. The streets, that's an important thing, that's why corridors don't work. You're forced to talk to your neighbours when you don't want to. Seriously. Really, so they're all laughing, I'm being serious. But so streets with very high traffic, it's not just that you know few of your neighbours on your side of the street, you know almost no one on the opposite side of the street. So there are relationships here which are relatively predictable. At an individual level, I'm not going to predict how you're going to respond, but give me 100 people and the data allows you to predict. Final one. Beautiful streets with a human rhythm of scale and sense of place, people tend to walk more slowly down them and to speak to people more as they do. So we can pull out these types of themes. So there's a utilitarian argument that place matters in the Little Platoons. I think from that flows place as metaphor. We care about places. It's a symbol, it's a metaphor for our communities and our families. You can see this in the polling. Indeed, Public First and others have done polling on this. Let me give you an example. We recently did a little report, really very little report, on what I call street scars. You've all seen them. It's when you've got cobbles or sets or York stones, probably on the type of street out here, and some expletive-deleted utility firm has come along, ripped them up to put something in, and just put a sort of scar of tarmac there, which then sits there unloved and untended for the next 9 months. I won't go into the legalities of that now, but when we started putting out on social media a few months ago requests for examples and then did our little report on it, we were deluged. So many people said, God, this really annoys me. I really care about this. And yet it was something we were a little bit nervous about. It felt a little bit modest, a little bit tentative. My God, it was like we sort of pulled out a plug. So I'd argue that place acts as a metaphor. If it's not cared for, then we don't feel valued for or cared for. And that's particularly true, as Adam can talk about probably better than me, when you then go outside the metropolis, and then it becomes a metaphor that is true in every sense of the word. I promise I won't go for too much longer. Thirdly, places as theatres, for not just for our public lives, but also for the interaction between our public life and our private lives. Unless we're sociopaths or misanthropes, we all need to commune with neighbourhoods and with communities, but also need our homes. We need our spaces. And good places allow us to move relatively seamlessly between the private and the public. The best streets, I'd argue, and I'd argue you can see this in the pricing data, are ones where you've got terrace streets, modest gardens, you can probably go up some steps before you go into your home, so you can easily get into your private space and the little back garden behind, then also come into the public space, into the street, perhaps just round the corner and down the road to the church, the pub, the neighbourhood shop, whatever it might be. So places, and this is a very conservative point, I think, because conservatives, I think, argue that we live our lives in real places, not in sort of abstract concepts. And I think the street and the well-designed village or town speaks to that. And finally, perhaps, but I don't think tangentially, places as sacred, as the communion with the past and the future. Places clearly have symbolic meaning to us. Obviously, the cenotaph, but also the neighbourhood pub, your grandparents' home. When the Crooked House pub was knocked down a few weeks ago, my golly, look at what that meant. It obviously meant something to people. It wasn't just the pure utilitarian Benthamite response would be saying this is ridiculous. And yet, it clearly wasn't ridiculous. It was clearly meaningful to people. In 431 BC, I know you all know this, but let me just remind you in case it's temporarily slipped your mind. In 431 BC, the Athenian statesman Pericles beseeched his fellow citizens to love their city in his famous funeral oration. I would have you day by day fix your eyes upon the greatness of Athens until you become filled with the love of her. And for those of you who know your Greek, which doesn't really include me, the word he used for love was actually the less metaphorical and the more physical word for love. So place matters to us. And I'd argue, and I won't go into deep time on this because I don't think time permits, for 3 reasons, and again you can see this in the pricing, places have actually got worse over the last 50 or 60 or 70 years. There are 3 reasons for that, I would say. One is modernism. We actually literally took away the sense of enclosure as something that matters and places need to look nice. Second, and this may be controversial, I don't know, is the motor car. Motor cars are great for getting us around suburbs and the countryside. They actually create more externalities, negative externalities, in towns or in tighter places than they do positives. The freedom of children to move around villages, towns and cities has provably and showably collapsed over the last 70 or 80 years. Your grandparents had more liberty when they were 14 than you did. And you probably had more liberty when you were 14 than your children do if they're 14. Mine are 15 and 13, so I straddle that age. And the third, perhaps this is the least offensive of the 3, is the third reason why we make less good places is materials. So we can now just put up really big faceless buildings incredibly cheaply and easily. If you look at the first iron-framed building in the UK, which is a Flaxman Maltings in Shropshire, it's actually rather lovely because it's all done with local bricks because it sort of had to be. There was nothing else to do it with. So we can now make faceless buildings without coherent complexity that we know that. Sorry, am I going on too long? I can see you looking nervous. So those are my key word, my first of my 2 paradoxes, my 3 problems and 4 reasons. Now let me quickly go through what I suggest we do about it. The first is we need to re-empower. I mean, the example of street scars shows that. We need to give people agency again of what happens to their places. Now, I think we're moving in the right direction on that. Neighbourhood planning was created a decade ago. It's sort of half right. It's done good things, but it's basically been captured by an overly complex, very difficult process. So it's only half work, but it's helpful. I think ultimately, and this will lead to my second point, we need to re-empower people to improve their places by right. We've looked in detail at Create Streets at, for example, legislation and regulation about planting street trees. most people want street trees. We could change the way the rules and the wiring works to make that easier. There are proposals on street votes, there are proposals which I and others have pushed for popular design via pattern books and design codes versus planning. And that's my second theme, which is moving away from planning and towards predictable patterns that people can influence locally about how you need to change places around here. So get places that are easier to walk in, more beautiful, more likeable. And then third, I think, is almost more verbal, more conceptual, is we actually need to rediscover as a community and as a sort of political society that the language about sacred and beautiful places and to revalue that. I mean, it's very telling that one of the most successful bits of social housing in the world, Fulgari social housing in Augsburg, is 500 years old. It funds itself by tourists coming to visit it to look at how marvellous it is, so that all the people who live in there in social housing can live there very freely. Now, maybe that's putting our point too far, but I don't see why in fact, there's no reason why we can't. We're much richer than we were in Germany 500 years ago. We can create social housing that is so beautiful it is worth paying to visit. And until we see that as something that we seek to do, I guarantee we will create worthless places that will be thrown away once they pass their first transitory use. My final two reasons, things we need to do, which link together, and again, maybe controversial, I don't know, we need to relearn both to create and to steward existing places to be what I call centrifugal, centripetal, rather, it's so easy to get that the wrong way around, centripetal rather than centrifugal. They come together, they have middles, we're pulled together rather than being spun out onto the ring road. And I'm afraid still, despite some good policy at a sort of high level, what we're doing in reality continues to pull us apart as neighbourhoods. So, Cambridge County Hall, taken from a fine 1920s or 30s neo-Georgian building near the middle and put into an ugly box on the ring road. And we see that just time after time. We're being pulled apart into living, just as the modernists predicted, in sort of zoned areas for housing over there and drive-to box stand for shopping over there. That takes away that serendipitous ability to bump into your neighbour or your friend or your colleague as you're going to the pub or the shops or dropping people off at school. And then ultimately, we need to relearn how to move free. And to put the car is one of the ways we move around, but not the only way we look to move around in towns and cities. So I think those are things I'd set out. And if I may, I've got another sort of minute or so, or 30 seconds, I'll just finish with a quote from a Tory. And Gavin he was about to say no, but I didn't let him give him the chance.
No, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. He describes the street Roger Scruton describes the street he was living in the 1980s for the marriage of the then Prince Charles. The English are not given to sitting on doorsteps or to standing about. Nevertheless, their movements in this street have a markedly leisurely quality, and when on the occasion of Prince Charles's marriage we gathered together for our party, the orderly windows and the porticos seemed to provide protection and endowed our comings and goings with a naturalness that they could hardly have acquired in a park or in any other place that was not so agreeably overlooked by accessible entrances. The classical wall, it's nearly finished, which is humanly proportioned, safe, gregarious and quietly vigilant, constantly reminds the pedestrian that he is not alone and that he is in a world of human encounter and that he must match the good manners of the wall which guides him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas. That's worthy of a round of applause. Just before I move on to Katie, I must satisfy my curiosity on the Greek.
I have no idea.
Was it Eros?
Yes, I think so. My Greek is very, very bad. But
interesting if so, because that implies being in love with, right? So almost like the relationship you'd have with a person during.
Exactly. Yes, that is the distinction. I'm happy to be corrected on ancient Greek.
I'm not trying to show off.
No, what you did. But you did show off.
Humble brag.
Thank
you. Thank you so much for those insights, Nicholas. Katie, I'm going to come to you next through the segue of the great Roger Scruton, who many years ago, when he was still with us, did a documentary which I think was called Why Beauty Matters.
Yes,
and he went to a very dilapidated high-rise housing estate in, I think it was Reading, which had been very badly vandalised. And I suppose he was exploring the relationship between the decline of place with criminality, antisocial behaviour, etc. And he said, this building has been badly vandalised, but it was kind of a horrible brutalist building, not very humane to live in. And he said, but you shouldn't blame the vandals. This place was built by vandals, which I think was a rather nice kind of twist on it. But clearly, this relationship is very important, and a lot of the work that Onward has done on levelling up has actually centred around this question of law and order, crime, antisocial behaviour, and how that can impede the flourishing of communities. And it's something that's very important to voters as well, in their sense of having a place that they're proud to call home. Could you tell us about your experience of dealing with and tackling crime and law and order, and how that's interacted with the communities that you represent.
Sure. Thank you. So great to be here, first time, and what a lovely space to be talking in when we're talking about nice spaces, very inviting. And I'm not going to try and quote and do the Greek or the Romans or whatever, so you're safe here. I'm only a simple girl from Sussex, what can I say? But it was really interesting. I was thinking about this when I was invited to speak, and pride in place and levelling up. And for me, I suppose that the three things I think of, and when I speak to the public, they talk about aspiration, they talk about equality, they talk about opportunity. But the one clear thing that is the barrier to all of those is crime and criminality. It impacts everybody. The impact of crime is huge on individuals and on communities, and the effects can go on for years and years and years, not just momentarily as well. I think when you were referring earlier to the buildings, and obviously the police now work quite hard to try and design out crime. So you can, if you are putting up a building now, contact Secured by Design, which is a company that's owned by policing, and they go out and they will, tell you where to put bits and pieces and make sure lights are up where they should be, and so on. But the broken windows theory, everybody's very familiar with now. If an area is allowed to decline, then other things start to decline as well. It just starts with, one little window being smashed in, or a weed growing through the pavements, or bins being left on the streets and not emptied, and so on. And over quite a short period of time, the whole area will denigrate, and then crime flourishes. It's a bit like a petri dish of germs, I always find. If you've got a little opportunity germ there, it will grow and grow and grow. And if you look at, I was just thinking, police are probably, when you're talking about the roots, police are absolutely integral to society. What's really interesting is if you read the media about the police, you'd think everybody hates them. Nationally, probably they do. But locally, we all love our local police officer. And when I speak to the public, all they ever want to see is more bobbies on the beat. That's all I ever hear about, because they're like the glue. They're the roots. They're the bits that hold society together. And Robert Peel said, the police are the people and the people are the police. And without that security amongst all of us, it's very difficult for, I think, society to carry on doing what it wants to do. So, if you look at shoplifting, for example, in the last year and a half, I've been quite vocal around, we've seen unprecedented levels. And why have we seen this rise? Well, it's a bit like the old broken windows theory again in place. With shoplifting, we're in those shops day in, day out. They are our spaces. They are our communal areas where we as society come together. I've got old ladies in villages who go into their local, well, I would say the post office, although there's not that many of them around now, but they'll go into the local store or the coffee shop because that is central to them. And if people are going in and shoplifting and it's being ignored, it gets worse. And those that are perpetrating the crime get more brazen, and they get more confident, and they come back time and time and time again. And I think this is a classic example of that broken windows theory, where the police overlooked it for too long because it wasn't serious enough, or maybe the value of the item being taken wasn't enough. And actually what they failed to really understand was the impact of that crime. They didn't join the dots up, and they couldn't see the wider impact it has until, of course, it gets to the point where it's got to now, where we've got unprecedented levels. And I'm sure if I asked anybody, if I said now to everybody, put your hand up in the room if you've been in a store and seen someone shoplift recently, I expect quite a few people would actually raise their hand. Yes, so it is, that for me was quite an interesting point. And going back to, crime and criminality, how it really affects where you live and your house prices. When the government said that they were going to put out crimes available, I think it's on police.uk, you can go on now, and you can see how many crimes have happened in your street We had one particular street in Haywards Heath, near where I live in Sussex, where apparently there were more crimes happening there than anywhere else. And the local insurers were looking at downgrading the house prices. What we found out was it was actually the police station that was there. And because, of course, they record lots of crimes in one area, that particular street had gone through the roof. And just, I mean, I won't go on for very long, just one more thought. When I talk about joined-up policing, we also need joined-up thinking when it comes to how we put that pride in place back amongst our government departments as well. Sometimes that joined-up thinking doesn't happen across government departments. I say sometimes very politely. Quite often it doesn't happen. And if I take as a recent example, we had the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Fantastic. In Sussex, I have 12 district and borough councils, all of whom get £1 million each to spend in their area, putting back pride of place. And they were allowed to spend it on the community, on the place, on the businesses, or on skills. And so I put together a business case to say, I would like to put an officer responsible for pride in place across all our high streets in each of your districts for a very small amount of money. Here's the business proposal. And every single one of those district and borough councils chucked it out and said no, because we'd rather spend it on cycle lanes because they're more important. And I do think sometimes we overlook that kind of joined up thinking. Delighted Adam's here because he's kind of responsible for the town boards bit. And there's a little bit more joined up thinking there because actually I've been included in that one, so I'm really delighted. But I'll just leave you with those, and I'm sure when we do more questions, more will come out in time.
Katie, thank you very much. Adam, I'm going to come to you now because I'd love to pick your brains, particularly on the experience that you've had recently visiting various towns throughout the UK. But Adam, I should have also mentioned, has worked with US mayors before and was also head of policy to Andy Street, Mayor of the West Midlands. So you have a lot of experience dealing with the municipal level, as well as newer experience in terms of smaller towns. From your perspective, what is the key to unlocking potential in towns, in communities, when, in particular, the economic direction of travel has been towards ever greater centralisation in London and the South East? And is it possible to reverse a sense of relative decline? How is that done?
So yes, I think it is. And I want to talk about pride, where pride comes from, because it's quite a kind of nebulous term and easy to throw around in politics, but quite hard to focus on and quantify. Why that pride matters. And actually why it's quite hard to advocate for pride as a thing we should focus on, particularly in policy terms, and what we should do in order to maintain that pride. So to come to that bit of your question last. If you think about what makes you proud of where you live, kind of conjure that up. If someone says, why are you proud of either where you live currently or where you grew up, just think of what that is. I think it's probably one of four things. And hold that in your head and just check if I'm right and yell at me afterwards if I'm wrong. I think it's either a historic building of some sort. That might be a statue in a town square. It might be a heritage asset. It might be a piece of industrial heritage. Or it is a green space, a park, a beach, a square, a sports club. This might be the wrong crowd for that, but it's often a sports club. Or a pub. Let me run through those four things. Historic building. Public First did some fantastic research asking people what made them proud of their area, and historic buildings came above sports clubs, local shops, local groups, and they argue that's because it makes identity that might be quite amorphous concrete. It allows people to say, I'm the sort of person that's from this place, and here's something which visualises what that identity is. Often if it's industrial heritage, it's a former mill, it's a town hall that might have been from the kind of Victorian era or previously. It points to a point of prosperity that might have existed in the area before. I've spent a lot of time in recent mill towns in the northwest, and you have gorgeous architecture in a lot of these places, often rows of shops on the bottom floor that are kind of begging shops or horrible architecture, and then gorgeous buildings just above. And so that heritage, those historic buildings, gives people a sense of who they are, where they're from, and what they're proud of. In South Shields, someone in a focus group told us that they drive the long way home so they can go past South Shields Town Hall every day and just give them a sense of their area and what it's about. Historic buildings massively matter. Secondly, on green spaces, we did some work in Walsall, and the Arboretum there is this gorgeous green space right in the middle of the town. Whenever we ask people what makes you proud of your patch, they probably firstly say nothing and make some sort of sarcastic comment about how things were going downhill. But if you press them, they talk about the park. So they like to walk their dog there, they like to spend time there. In Jarrow, someone described the beachfront as the main reason that they've stuck around in their area and described South Tyneside as like the Algarve with a fleece. Which I think they basically should put on all of the posters for that area. But if you look, coastal communities massively outperform in terms of the level of pride people have in their place relative to the level of deprivation there, right? You'd expect a lot of these areas to have some crushing levels of poverty, to be places where lots of people are trying to escape. But actually, lots of people say, my part of the country is the most beautiful, and a lot of that is to do with that waterfront, with that view that goes out front. So natural assets, green spaces, beaches, parks, hugely important. Third thing, sports clubs. If you say to someone, how's your area doing? They'll often, again, pause largely and take a breath and say, well, let's talk about how the local football club's doing. If you go to Oldham, they will tell you that the plight of Oldham Athletic is the plight of that place. The fact that foreign owner came in, stripped the assets, they've plummeted down. I think the only founding member of the Premier League to be now outside of the EFL. They see that as symbolic of what's happened in their area and what's happened to their place. In other areas, I mean, Wrexham's the most classic example recently where there's been real investment in that football club. But also football clubs and sports clubs and rugby league clubs, actually, particularly in lots of parts of the Midlands and the North, that have seen their role in building a sense of pride. In Accrington, where I was recently, every 8-year-old is given an Accrington Stanley football shirt by the club. And that's partly because the owner, Andy Holt, was just outraged at loads of people wearing Blackburn shirts, or worse, Liverpool shirts, in his part of the world. But every 8-year-old, once a year, gets in a coach, goes to Accrington Stanley's football club, and the first team hand them an Accrington Stanley shirt. And they wear that then around their area, and that gives them a sense of pride and of belonging. So sports clubs, enormously important. Burnley, there's been some phenomenal work to link Burnley Football Club. In fact, physically, they're now doing a lot of regeneration work between Turf Moor and the town centre, the kind of turf to town walk, to make really clear that that kind of aspirational Premier League venue, I say aspirational, not doing very well at the moment, but usually that aspirational venue is something that everyone should feel a sense of belonging to, a sense of association with. The fourth one is pubs. So my favourite books is, I haven't got a quote in front of me. If I'd known I was speaking, I would have brought one. But Ray Oldenburg wrote this gorgeous book called The Great Good Place, which looked at third space. It's written in the kind of 50s or 60s, but talked about the kind of pubs of Britain, the beer halls of Germany, the cafes of Paris, and examined the role that those third spaces perform, the places that were not home or were not an office. And it's those pubs, those cafes, that can be everything in helping someone want to live in an area, want to spend time. They drive footfall and all those sorts of good things, but they can also be a place of kind of communion and collective gathering where a lot of those sorts of formal institutions have slipped away. So those four things, I think, are some of the places that pride comes from, makes the sort of slightly amorphous concept concrete. Why do they matter? So I was in Nelson recently, in Pendle, a town named after a pub, weirdly, the Lord Nelson in town. It was previously two villages. They needed to rename it, and so they just called it Nelson because that was one of the things that was there. Maybe not a great start for long-term civic pride. And usually when I'm doing visits as part of my job advising the government on towns, we meet with the council, councillors, community groups, whatever else. Here, we got to meet with 15 teenagers who are at a youth club. And I sort of had to strip all the policy wonk language out of my opening pitch about what the government's long-term plan for towns was. It's actually bloody hard to do. And just ask them what they wanted for their area. So a couple of things that are really interesting. One, safety and security, number one, right? So you expect sometimes an idea that, well, of course there are kind of curtain twitchers and old ladies that are worried about spending time in the town centre, but really they're overreacting. The number one group that are worried about levels of antisocial behaviour and low-level crime are the primary victims of that, who are often young people themselves, right? Yeah. And the solution that they're after was, of course, they were like, we need more things to do. By the way, they want a Primark, they want a JD, if anyone's writing this down. Primark, JD. They want a place to buy K-pop CDs. I didn't know anyone bought CDs anymore, but apparently the majority of CDs sold are now K-pop or Taylor Swift. They want places to do those things, but they want visible policing, right? So they're actually, and that might be PCSOs, that might be specials, that might be wardens, but they want an adult authority in the spaces they're in to make sure that they are safe because they're the primary victims. But I mention these young people because I asked them, how many of you want to stay in Nelson, want to live in Nelson when you're older? And they all laughed at me, firstly, raucously laughed at me, and then said, obviously not, no. When I asked them where they'd move, oddly, they all said Burnley, which is just down the road, another one of our long-term plan for towns areas, all of whom either want to move to Manchester or Liverpool, but regardless, they all wanted to move away. And I asked them why. And they gave lots of answers, safety and security, there's not a JD, etc., etc. And then this one kid who was in the back right of the room wearing this bright red Avengers t-shirt, who hadn't spoken for the rest of the session, kind of paused and said, I can't even be bothered to put up Christmas lights. He said, every other town around here puts up Christmas lights, and I can't ever be bothered around here. If they don't care about that, why should I stay? And I think the reason I make a case in policy terms for Pride in Place is because one of the biggest risks to our towns is that people who can leave do. People with the talent or the means or the wherewithal to get ahead in life feel like they should use that talent and those means to escape. And what that means is not only do you get the kind of technical term of brain drain, but you basically mean that those that really want to do something with their lives and build their future don't live in a place. You lose that aspiration, you lose that sense. And so when we heard a council official in a place I won't name the other day, when I said you've got to do loads of engagement with your community to develop your plans, said, the problem with asking the community around here is you're just going to get bins and benches. What do you mean bins and benches? And they said, well, you know, they're just going to want to get the bins empty more regularly and fix the benches. Yeah. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, right? And now, of course, if you've got a 20 million fund and 10 years to do it and you want to spend 20 million on bins and benches, we'll probably be a bit sceptical, and I have the Treasury a little bit annoyed at me for how we've used those funds. That is a perfectly reasonable place to start, to say to the community, right, let's get that stuff done. Let's make sure you're not wading through litter and walking through a door adorned in graffiti in order to do this community meeting. That's a fine place to start. So that's where Pride comes from. That's why it matters. What do we do in order to steward it? The challenge with all of those things I outlined is that they take a really long time to build up. You know, historic buildings, generations, green spaces don't just pop up overnight. Football clubs, again, have that sense of being part of a generation of people. They really don't come up overnight. People are very rarely proud of a new thing in their area, right? It might be there's a wonderful cafe that's just opened, but it's often in a nice part of town, on a nice town square, among some nice public realm. It's very hard to create sources of pride, which means that stewardship, in a very kind of small c, Scrutonian conservative way, matters, because where those assets are either damaged or become forlorn and forgotten, or worse, are lost, that has a sometimes irreparable impact on a sense of pride in a place. That's why the graffiti on the cenotaph or the hanging baskets that are dying don't just matter because they're an individual bit of the public realm that's broken, but because that was a source of pride and identity for people, and they've seen it ignored and run roughshod over. So stewardship really matters, and stewardship by the state is often very challenging. Local government budgets are massively pressed. National government are probably quite bad at identifying those things that matter to local people. When football clubs or media assets fall into foreign hands, they might not be good stewards. So we need to think about what are those things that give pride to an area, ensure that we realise they're important, and then ensure that they have the right stewardship. That might be by communities themselves, it might be by local areas, it might sometimes be by councils. But the question there should be not who's going to maximise commercial return from this, although revenue might sometimes be important, but who's going to ensure this continues to be a source of pride and mean that people who want to go far can, in the vernacular, stay local. So I'll leave it there, but pride is something that is really underappreciated and looked down on, particularly in policy circles. And actually, I think it's the key to unlocking a lot of the broader ambitions we have around levelling up.
Thank you, Adam. Fascinating stuff. We are hoping that Minister Lee Rowley is on his way.
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes, subject to proceedings in the House. But whilst we wait for him, wait for his arrival, we'll just do a little bit of discussion. Nicholas, I'd like to come back to you on housing in particular, if I may. So one of the themes that Onward has explored a lot, and which we are very passionate about in our Future of Conservatism work, is the idea of home. and that could be the idea of home in terms of nationhood and the national community, home in terms of local communities and places, as we've been discussing this evening, but also quite literally homes, people actually having a place to live, and more than a place to live, but a place to put down roots, raise a family, and so on. One of the challenges in policy making is perhaps the tension between people's desire for homes, in terms of housing shortage and people not being able to get on the property ladder, and other people's sense of home, this community is mine, I don't want to see it changed in ways that I don't recognise with unpleasant new builds and so on. I know you've done fantastic work in this space. How do we navigate those competing desires for people, for that sense of home?
Carefully, I think. I'll say two things. Just on that word home, actually. It's always puzzled me that the French don't have a word for home. That's a sideline. But it is really striking. We have a little swear box for this in Create Streets, actually, because in almost every development firm or planning practice, or dare I say, architectural firm that we've worked with or interacted with some very honourable exceptions, they don't use the word home. Home is a bit sort of low status as a thing to say in a professional circle. Certainly developers tend to talk about units, or if you're lucky, a dwelling. How many of you aspire to live in a unit? I sort of thought you might say that. So there, actually sort of, and I know it's not quite your question, but it sort of comes back to what I was half saying, and I think what Adam was saying very eloquently is, actually we just sort of, as a profession and as a public, people setting public policy, either national or locally, let alone as a sort of civic society, we actually need to care about home. We need to talk about it and value it. So the first part of your answer, it sort of may seem paradoxically simple, is, well, let's just talk about homes and creating homes and stewarding homes and allowing places to be homely. Again, it's sort of word it's quite easy to look down upon. No, places that are homely are good. It's where we want to spend time. And so that's point one. Point two would be, and I don't want to get into some technical planning discussion because I will lose the small members of the public who are still listening to me. But because we make it so hard to create new buildings and homes in this country, particularly in the southeast, what the planning system and developers end up doing, and you can't blame them, is to squeeze as much as they can into a small number of sites where they're actually able to build something. And this is particularly true in London, but it is true all across the southeast and also Manchester and a few other sort of hotspots. So you'll get suburbia, 2-storey coming along, and then suddenly you've got an opportunity area. Some old factory or old sort of processing plant from the 1950s or something that got left behind by the Victorians. And suddenly you go up from 2 stories to sort of 20 or 25 or certainly more than 15. And what you can find, in the polling, is that people find that very offensive to their concept of my neighbourhood. You can argue that's rational, you can argue it's irrational, but it's certainly consistent and very, very predictable. What we find in our polling is that once you go above if you've got a well-articulated facade, by that I mean it's got coherent complexity, it's got rhythm, it's got variety in a pattern, it's probably built in the local materials, and people are very aware of their local materials. I'll come back to that. You can get actually public support up to about 6 or 7 stories. You couldn't do that in the middle of a village, but you can get actually, I wouldn't say easily, but you can get that. But once you go beyond that, the public support just completely collapses. I mean, down to sort of 5 or 6%. Even lots of people accept in principle, correctly, the need for new housing. My God, we do need new housing, but it's a platonic desire for new housing. It's not actually sort of real round here when you propose that. So to answer your question, we've got to make it easier in ways that local public will support for places to densify and, perhaps a better word, intensify organically, spontaneously within a rules-based system. And I say we need to move from planning to pattern books that are acceptable. So what are the ways in which a street of 2-storey 1930s or 1960s houses can, with local consent, become 4-storey terraced houses, can add a shop there or a pub there. That's how our towns historically developed. Round here, we're close to Westminster Abbey and the old Westminster Palace, this was 2-storey huts in the 12th century. And it's just grown, the street pattern here will be very, very ancient, but they've just grown organically over time, and now they're sort of stuck in amber. So I think that's ultimately the answer, is move from planning to something that with local consent allows buildings to evolve in ways that respect the natural vernacular. What we find, I'll finish on this, and it's particularly true in the countryside and in smaller towns, people are staggeringly aware of their local build material. And we do this. If you go and ask people in bits of Yorkshire, what should new buildings around here look like, what they should be built out of, even people who couldn't tell you the name of the local building material unerringly identify as York stone as the thing they want it built out of. Go to Sussex or Surrey and you'll tend to get red bricks or hung tiles.
Or flint.
Or flint. But people are incredibly responsive. They probably, if you ask people, what's the local stone around here, they probably can't tell you. But they can recognise it. And on the whole, between 60 and 80% of them will go for that as a thing. So I think, and again, you quite often find when you talk to, when I talk to developers or planners, that they're quite scathing about that as a sort of, conservatism and Ludditism. Well, no. And the lovely thing about stone, particularly a little less so of brick, is that stone is an incredibly sustainable material, particularly when it's quarried locally. So it ticks modern boxes as well as old boxes. Is that a vague answer?
That's not at all vague. It's very specific and comprehensive.
In brackets, too specific.
Can I just make one comment? What really struck me, what you said about unit or dwelling, I was sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, when the police record burglary, they record burglary dwelling or burglary non-dwelling.
Yes,
they don't say burglary home.
And it's the
language.
Exactly. And it's the home. I mean, the home should be sacrosanct. And it's I remember when my house the house I grew up in was burgled, and my mother, quite reasonably, was very, very upset about it. It was an invasion of our privacy, of her privacy, of our home. It was that more than the actual value of what was stolen that was so upsetting to my parents and above all my mother.
Really interesting.
Katie, on this subject of the link between policing and a sense of local identity, confidence in law and order, pride and so on, I was struck by the comment that you made about how prevalent the view is that people in communities just want to see more bobbies on the beat, and that there's higher trust when there is someone that they know and that they recognise.
Yeah.
John Yates, who's not with us this evening, unfortunately, but I know he's written in the past.
He's with Lee Rowley.
Has written in the past about this being true the other way round as well, which is it actually helps the police when they've got good intimate knowledge of the local area and the individuals and characters and places where there's trouble and where there's not, and families and so on. What are the impediments to having a genuinely relational, localised kind of approach towards policing? If it's something that voters want, how can we move towards that?
I think, it's something that a lot of police forces are moving towards more. And so what I'm seeing is now a lot of my colleagues and their chief constables are saying we need town officer, police officers who are just dedicated for the town space. Or you're seeing, for example, we set up a rural crime team. I had a previous chief constable who used to say to me, oh no, crime, Katie, is just crime. It either happens in the town or it happens in the rural area. And I thought, not sure I agree with that. But I couldn't do anything about it because they have operational control and they make those decisions. But of course, when my new chief constable came along, she and I had a much more aligned way of thinking. And so we set up a dedicated rural crime team. And that we now have 22 officers in that, and they cover all sorts of, the heritage crime, where you see a lot of stealing from the churches, as well as the farming and so on types of crime. But it's a really interesting move back. I think in the last, certainly when I came into policing in 2012, there was a big move. There was a big move to more of the sort of complex crimes, your rapes, your serious sexual offences, and so on, and a move away from the crimes that matter to us. Because they weren't seen as that important, and they weren't as complex. And I think we lost that, and now we're starting to see it moving back that way, and great, because that gives people confidence. We feel much happier when we see a police officer in our community, and we're more likely then to pick the phone up to the police and give them that vital bit of intelligence that they need to solve the crime that they've been looking for. So.
Can I just jump in on that, Gavin?
Yeah,
please.
So this point about kind of crime and then a feeling of safety and security is really important, and in some ways is linked to this conversation about kind of pride as something that's a bit more amorphous and is felt versus an economic indicator you might use to assess an area, right? So crime has fallen by about 75% in the last 30 years. If you exclude fraud and computer misuse, not because it's unimportant, but because it plays havoc with the numbers, crime is down. It's just factually correct, particularly the most violent forms of crime. But people don't feel much safer or more secure. Any way you look at it, right? So you can look at whether people approve of the police, whether people think the government are doing a good job in managing crime, whether people feel that crime rates in their area have increased or stayed the same. People don't feel safer. And we did a report on this recently, and if you dig into that, that is because if you ask people what types of crimes matter in your area, and we've seen loads of polls on this, 3 things always come out on top. Antisocial behaviour, theft and burglary, and drug offences. And if you look at the trends for those 3 crimes, they are not universally down. So antisocial behaviour, interestingly, recorded instances have dropped massively over the past 10 years, but survey data of people saying they've experienced ASB has gone up. Right? So people just aren't bothering to report it because they don't think anything will be done. Drug offences have remained constant. About a quarter of people say they've seen kind of drug use or drug dealing in their area. And theft, particularly the most visible forms of theft, like shoplifting that Katie described, are on the up. So you've got this gap then between people saying they feel safe and secure and the amount of crime that is going on. Now, a lot of people I've chatted to, either officials or policy folk, have said, well, people are just wrong. They're just incorrect, right? And so why should we put more resources into this thing? Because they are wrong, crime is down, and so we should put it on other things that matter. Now, there is a sort of policy wonkish answer, which is, well, the felt might become the data because people stop reporting and. But I really think there is something, and this is where kind of the political matters in policy terms, because if you do just leave it to kind of officials or non-political folk, they will be led by that sort of reasoning. But any MP or police and crime commissioner knows that that lived experience matters. If you feel unsafe or insecure, if you feel you don't have a lack of pride, even if it's difficult to capture that sometimes in the broader data about economic prosperity or anything else, that matters, and it deserves a priority in how we think about what we do. And I'm glad that people like Katie are therefore emphasising neighbourhood and local policing. So even as crime rates are going down, people also feel a sense of safety and security.
If I may, just for 10 seconds, I know you want to get to the Minister.
10 seconds, Nicholas.
It's also something that's really striking when we do community engagement and master planning and design in prosperous and less prosperous parts of the country. It's a binary difference. So it's nearly always the first and the prominent thing that comes up in community discussions in Sunderland or in Grimsby. I wouldn't say it doesn't matter in Sussex, but it comes up much less. So it's really quite a binary distinction we see.
Right, yes. We've got 20 minutes left, and then we have a hard stop at 1:45. And I'm very keen to bring in Minister Lee Rowley, who's just joined us. Thank you for being here this evening with us, Lee. I hope that all's well in the House. Just by way of brief introduction, Lee Rowley was appointed Minister for Housing in the Department for Levelling Up in December 2023. Has previously served as Parliamentary Under Secretary of State in the same department and in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, is a former government whip and is the MP for North East Derbyshire. Lee, thank you for being here. Our discussion this evening has focused on the theme of pride in place. Obviously, this is a very important subject for the department in which you're a minister, and how we can restore a sense of civic pride, a sense of civic flourishing, both on the kind of the social side of things, community connection, and Adam spoke very eloquently about people's feeling of pride, but also the economic side around access to housing, the built environment, and so on. Just for 5 minutes or so, could you talk to us? It's really kind of a blank check. How do you feel?
You don't hear that very often.
A blank check, because we're just keen to get your thoughts. How can we best deliver a sense of local levelling up in some of our communities that feel left behind? In particular, given your brief, through the built environment and through housing reform.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And firstly, I'm so sorry for being late, and I really apologise. I used to hate it when MPs swanned in halfway through a thing, decided that they knew everything, and just sort of started talking to people. So I'm about to do it, and I'm really sorry. I obviously don't have the context, so this may be well off beam. But speaking on a personal level, as a Redwall MP, as they talk about, as opposed to Minister, and I'll come to the portfolio later. And without getting too existential, if the question is how do we foster a sense of pride in place, we've got to recognise there's a group of people within society who aren't that interested in place any longer. Now that's partly growth in social media, that's part that people can live in their own bubbles, it's partly that they don't have to have a huge amount of interaction on a day-to-day level with their physical geography. And then we have a whole heap of national and supranational trends around internationalism, removing the concept of the nation state, all of those things, which I don't know whether is the purpose of what we're supposed to be talking about today, but there is just a cohort of people who are not that interested in geographical place any longer, either by choice that they don't need to because they'd rather spend their time in circles which aren't related to geography, or ideology because they have decided they want to dismantle geography. Decided they want to dismantle the concept of nation state or the concept of community. But putting that aside, I don't go too far into that rabbit hole. For the vast majority of people, they do care about geography and they do care about place. My seat is a seat which the Conservative Party has never won. I know this isn't a Conservative discussion, but the Conservative Party has never won other than in 2017 in 80 years. And the reason they flipped, I think, and it's my hometown, it's where I grew up, and so I saw it over 35 years before I got elected, and 40 odd now I've been elected, is I just think they got really jacked off with being ignored for so long. And that represented itself on the Brexit vote, 63% leave, represented itself in electing somebody who, back when he was a kid at school, never thought that the 18,000 majority that his seat had towards Labour would ever go anywhere near the Conservatives. And it is because there is a general feeling that nobody is listening. So if you want to start bringing people, strengthening the social fabric, which is very, very rich underneath, I should say. When I go into my community, so I represent 40 or so different parts of North Derbyshire, there is a huge amount of closeness. Some of the communal groups, organisations, activities that if you scratch below the surface, you can find them. Sometimes they're hard to find. They were harder to find in my more working class areas than they are in my more middle class areas. But it is absolutely there. So the social fabric is there. It's just hidden in many instances. But as a sort of from a sort of conceptual basis, they've got to feel like that they're being heard. If you want people to have pride in their place, if you want people to believe that their place matters, they've got to feel that they're being listened to from a geographical perspective and from an individual perspective. And that is a question that all of us as politicians, all of us those involved in the political process need to reflect on. There are definitely a group of parts of the country, Levelling Up is the closest proximity, but it's not perfect, who just don't feel that they have been listened to. Doesn't mean they should be, we should pat them on the head all the time. It doesn't mean that we should insubstantively just say yes, 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 and whatever. It means that we actually have to engage with them properly, including when they do not support the consistent views of the guys over there or the broader ecosystem around them. They have just as much right to be heard. The second thing is, I think, there's got to be a down payment and investment in physical geography. In my part of the world, we didn't get that for many years. We haven't had much spending. I'm a small state Conservative, but I recognise that there are times when government does have a responsibility, and I can see in my geography that there was need both to pump prime, and there was a need to give a clear sense from central government that they were listening. And the clearest way you can do that is by changing things on the ground that make a difference. And so things that we've done, like the Towns Fund, have been super helpful for me. I've got 2 Towns Funds long before I became a minister, so it wasn't because of that. And you can physically see that people are genuinely interested in how their physical geography is changing. And then the thing from a ministerial perspective, and there's many things I could talk from a ministerial perspective, but I'm sure Nicholas has talks about a number of them, is place matters, beauty matters, aesthetic matters, and that is something which I think is really missed in the sort of maelstrom of the last 30 or 40 years over that place that I've just come from. I'll give you one last example and I'll be quiet. My second biggest town is a town called Claycross. It is a town that sprung up literally out of nowhere in the 1850s when Robert Stevenson was shoving a train tunnel through a hill, and he found a load of coal, and it turned from the tiniest hamlet into a town of 10,000 based on coal and mining over 100 years. And then it lost its purpose it lost it in the sort of 1970s when the last coal mines closed, 1980s, and it's regained it. But it was really unsure of itself until a few years ago. And the fact that we've been able to make sure the bus services still work, the fact that we've been able to do some upgrades to their town centre, the fact that we've been able to totally redo their leisure centre, the fact we've brought banking back to their high street through a banking hub, it is all those kind of small-scale interventions where people actually eventually do say, en masse, actually, do you know what? Something is changing. People are listening for the first time in 50 years, and this is making a difference. So I don't have the full answer about how you bring back pride in place, but I can sort of see from my personal experience, how you move communities who are quite jaded about things along a continuum which makes them happier than they were a few decades ago.
I think one of the themes that's really coming out this evening is the sense that this is a jigsaw, and restoring something like pride in place and the resilience of communities is something that has to be approached from lots of different angles. It's the law and order and social behaviour, it's the built environment, it's the economy, it's high streets. I'm conscious of time, so I think I'll move to some audience questions now. If you could please keep your question short. I will cut you off if you go on too long, and please can it be a question? Do we have microphones roaming around, or are people just shouting? There we are. We have a microphone over there. Please do wait till you get the microphone, and then say...
Very strict with the audience.
Yeah.
Why?
I was going to say they're too scared to do anything.
Yeah.
Well, I see, I'm used to Conservative Party conference, you see, where you get all sorts of crazy people coming out of the woodwork. People like me. Yeah, please do speak to the microphone, say your name and organisation if you have one, and I'll take two at a time. So I'll start with the gentleman back there. You were up for your first.
Brave Local House of Lords and Eastbourne.
Yay, Sussex.
You cannot get permission from the council to do anything. We can't even mow the verge outside the house. They find that the cost of giving you permission is so huge, the hoops they have to jump through, the difficulty of managing it afterwards. What can we do to make it simple to give people agency over their immediate environment?
Okay, so a question around planning, regulation, that sort of thing. And here.
Good evening, Mike Salem from the Consumer Choice Centre. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. There are so many questions I'd like to ask, but I'll focus particularly on the Future High Street Fund. How do you think that turned out to be? Is it successful? Do we just throw money at problems, or is there more to it than that?
Okay, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the high street question, and I'm going to give that to you, Adam.
Thought you would.
Do you have a view on that?
I do. So the programme I chair, the Long-Term Plan for Towns, tries to learn from some of the challenges of previous funds. So the Future High Street Funds was the right idea. A lot of our high streets are going to need capital investment in order to make them viable in the long term, and they'll need some support from very good people like Mark Robinson, who chaired the High Streets Task Force, to help them think about what that's going to look like. Almost certainly going to be about less retail, because there's going to be less demand for that, more residential in town centres, more of an experience that means that people go to those high streets and you have footfall, right? All of the right stuff to do. The problem with the Future High Streets Fund, which I think I can say I'm sort of half an employee of Lee's, is that if it's...
He's shaking his head.
Not anymore, I'm glad now. If it's only capital, then you can have some very shiny buildings on a high street, but you don't have the revenue support, which is for the groups, individuals, events, whatever else, that might sustain that place. Now, of course, what you can't do is forever subsidise a high street. Eventually, it needs to stand on its own 2 feet commercially. But what you might do is have some of those areas that are on social rent. So you might have, I don't know, a bit of the public sector that pops up on that high street. You might have a charity or community hub operating out of it. You might have subsidised rent for a period of time for some of the properties that sit on top of some of these often gorgeous heritage high streets in areas. You might want to bid into things like the National Lottery Heritage Fund to regenerate some parts. So the problem with the Future High Street Funds, it was capital only, and what you didn't do is build the sort of civic stewardship that I described that you really need to make those high streets work. The best example of that stewardship is usually business improvement districts. Yeah. I think they are basically wonderful wherever they exist. They are really a little platoon, right? They might have a very wonky sounding name, but they are groups of business owners coming together, putting their hands in their pockets and taking responsibility for the patch where their business is. The problem is in lots of really impoverished areas, the business owners don't have the money in their pocket to put towards that sort of collective good. So part of the programme I run, the Long-Term Plan for Towns, will involve some areas seeking to subsidise, in the initial instance, they'll have to stand on 2 feet eventually, the creation of those bids. So right scheme with the right idea. I think that the programme I run learns from its flaws and is obviously completely fantastic and a well-designed programme.
Who designed it, Adam?
I don't know. It was some think tank, I think.
Lee, what do you think?
I'm going to give the first question, if I may, to Minister Rowley. So this was a question on giving local people agency over their local place, planning, regulation. How do you give them more agency over what gets done and what gets built in their communities?
Well, we're struggling to manage risk, right? And that's a fundamental problem across lots of democracies. We struggle to manage risk centrally, and then we struggle to manage risk locally in individual areas, and that is a manifestation of a culture which doesn't quite know when to let go. And so we have this sort of halfway house of people being involved enough so that they can control when they want to, but not enough so that the risk can be distributed in case anything goes wrong. And that is just a facet now in lots of Western democracies, again, without getting too existential. And we're going to have to reverse it. It's no political party's fault. It's no individual's fault. It's no Prime Minister's fault. It's been growing for 30 years, and we're going to have to reverse it over a period of time. And it's going to have to start with some clear views about what the individual can do and what agency they have. The fact that the state can't do everything, whether in its local or its national form. We need a better conversation about trade-offs, about what the state is able to do, about how it has limited capacity, about if it does lots of things badly, it doesn't help whatsoever, so it might as well should do some things well, and that's going to be a 10, 15, 20-year conversation which needs to happen. In terms of immediate things, what we're trying to do, I can't really comment much on the licensing side because I haven't looked at that extensively yet, but on the planning side, we are trying slowly to both lift up parts of the planning system into national policies so that there is less discretion locally, which is an attempt to try and create more standardisation. People have views on that, but then also to try and devolve greater power locally so that better decisions can be made in one location. But ultimately, none of us, I can't, none of my colleagues can, that place over there can't control a system with 200 odd different actors in terms of local government before you get to parishes and things like that. So they're going to have to realise that with the limited resources they've got, and they spend a lot of time telling us they've got limited resources, that they need to focus their attention in a way which works for the good of the community, as opposed to getting involved in everything in a little bit.
We've got a hard stop at 2:45, so I'm just going to try and squeeze in a couple more. Alex, and then the gentleman here.
Hello, Alex Morton, I work for the CPS. Nicholas, this one is aimed at you.
Oh, I was trying to get out of question.
So design and so on has been being talked about, you said, in the last few years, place and so on. But actually it's been going for a long time, since at least the Rogers Review, which was, about almost 25 years ago now. Why haven't things improved, which I think is a broad area, and what would you do to change it? Because I think what you're saying is quite compelling, but let's be honest, depressingly, this conversation has been going for 25 years. I don't think there has been much of an improvement in the quality of places that we are creating. I've just come back from the American exurbs. They are better than what we build in lots of this country. They have exurbs in America now actually have centres because they've worked out that people like them. So they are car-based, but they actually have high streets in the weird middle of this sort of car-based sprawl. And yet we haven't gone anywhere in 25 years, really. Why?
Should we do the answer now, since I was directly to you, and then we'll go to the second?
I thought it was to leave. Okay. So I would.
You're happy to take it,
I'm very happy to take it. So actually, at Wigley, I was looking again at the Rogers report from I think 28 years ago or 25. So I think it missed actually half of what needed to be talked about. So I don't think it did talk about design. It was too. I mean, it had lots of good stuff in it. It was essentially the case for dense cities. There's a great case to be made for dense cities. It isn't the case to be made, it isn't the same case, some overlaps, with beautiful, walkable, loved ex-mining towns in Derbyshire. It totally lost that. It didn't talk about towns, it didn't talk about neighbourhoods, or it did only implicitly. So I actually think it's only in the last decade that we've started to have that wider conversation. So I'd slightly, if you'll forgive me, reject the premise of the question. I'd secondly say why haven't we made as much progress as we should? And I agree that we haven't. And I think the Minister rightly started talking about this, is we still have a very old planning system. I think it's getting better. I think it's getting less odd, and you just touched on that, but we still essentially are running a controlled experiment, having a uniquely discretionary system with a uniquely unpredictable quality ask. We're unpicking that, but it's difficult. It's hard to totally change the way a whole sector of the economy gets regulated. So I think we're making progress, but are not there yet. I wish we'd gone faster. Finally, and this is perhaps more controversial, and this is something that's a challenge Great Streets is finding. So we struggle to recruit people. We struggle to recruit architects or urban designers who are happy and unashamed to start the entire design process by asking what do people locally love and find beautiful, and how not to, slightly misquote, but not to misquote, but to quote an official I heard talking a few weeks ago, how do we not worry about, quote, adjusting for the prejudices of the public, full end quote. So, I mean, we need to create streets. And moving into education, there's only one architectural university in the West, by which I include North America as well as Europe, that unashamedly teaches vernacular and classical design. So I think until we actually start having planners and architects coming through who would find what I've just said not offensive, or certainly not challenging, then I think it's actually very hard, because you can say what you like in the regulatory policy, but if you cannot find architects who can do it, well, you're sort of stuffed. Yeah. End of question.
Very quickly, gentleman here.
Good evening. I'm Piers Brannigan. I'm a Conservative GLA candidate for North East London. My day job, I work with clients in the built environment sector on programmes of engagement, consultation and communication. I think one of the biggest issues at the moment in this country is obviously house building, and that generational contract social fabric has been destroyed between home ownership. Through the day job and also through my campaigning, it's obvious that the main opposition people have to development is that they find out about it way too late. They find out when that notice goes up on the lamppost or the leaflet goes through the door to invite them to a consultation event. I think if people were better involved at the allocation stage, at the outset of the local plan process, that's where we can get people involved, invested in seeing these communities come forward and actually have that investment in place to happen as well. So,
and your question is?
My suggestion is,
do you have a question?
Yeah, my question is, do you think we should be encouraging local authorities to involve communities in the allocation process of local plans instead of just having design panels?
I'll give the Minister an opportunity to comment on that. Is there anything you want to say on that at all?
Yes, is the short answer. The reality is that planning is very frustrating to lots of people, as you indicate, because they get involved in quote-unquote the wrong bit. Yeah. And if lots of decisions are taken up front, it is even more frustrating when you get told you're being asked some questions which you think are genuine, and actually half the point has been ceded, X number of X amount of months before. So yes, that is absolutely the case, what we need to do. But the other half, which we don't have time to go into, housing is not the problem in my view. Housing is absolutely not the problem. There is a process problem in terms of what you're describing, and housing is a manifestation of a set of other policy choices that have either been made deliberately or by default, which is where people get to. Housing is a function of population. Population is a function of a number of other things. And until we link those things closer together, we're never going to get totally the frustration of why people are not as happy with housing as we would like them to be.
If I may, just for 5 seconds, we have quite an odd debate where we have the debates on a case-by-case basis when a development comes forward. In America and much of Europe, more of the politics, I say move the democracy forward, more of it happens in the setting of what we call the local plan, the French call the local urbanisation, Americans call the zoning or whatever it is. And you have your fights then, and you should have a fight about it. It should be politicised, but you have it strategically rather than tactically time after time after time.
I'm afraid we are out of time. I'd love to take more questions, but we are under orders from the venue. We do need to be moved on, I'm afraid. But thank you very much for your questions and your participation. And thank you very much to all of our speakers this evening, who I think have been excellent in their presentations and in their answers to questions. So can you join me in giving a round of applause to them? A brief plug, please do join us for our next Future of Conservatism event, which will be in March. That will be available to look up on the Onward website. There will be an email that comes around about that. Please subscribe to our mailing list and you see details of that. Our next event, this has been focused very much on domestic, Britain, place, community. The next event will be about Britain's role in the world, its trading relationships, its economic role, economic security, supply chains, and our relationship with China in particular. It'll be fascinating, great lineup of speakers. We're going to have a minister there, so look out for that. Also, do look out for an upcoming series of events which Onward will be holding on housing, in which we are going to get our in-house economic superbrain, Tim Loynick, who some of you may have heard of. If you haven't, he's advisor to multiple chancellors of the Exchequer, very well known in Westminster. He's going to be interviewing a number of experts on all things housing, looking at the kind of the rough demographics of this room, probably the most important economic issue for most of us here. So look out for more details of that when it comes along. Do follow Onward on Twitter, and as I say, subscribe to our mailing list. And hopefully we'll see you all again at the next
Can I do one very quick
One
plug?
more thing.
Onward, Create Streets, Nicholas's organisation, and an organisation called Labour Together, next Friday are co-hosting a conference specifically on this issue of the social fabric called Restitch, putting together people like Ben Ansell, who delivered the Reith lectures this year, Tom Tugendhat, the Security Minister, Steve Reed, the Shadow Environment Secretary, all talking about community and white matters. It's in Coventry for a day. There are still places. So if you would like to come along, find one of the Onward team, and it will all be online and all streamed. So there'll be lots of these sorts of conversations happening there.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you very much.